My name is Marco. I will be the moderator for this session. I would like to introduce you, Yuri Fattah, and the presentation is Regulation as an Enabler for Innovation. Yuri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Fab Labs for this opportunity. I would have a short, well, I have a presentation. I was going to say short, but let's see how it goes. So let me share my screen. Okay, so I hope you can see the screen now. Okay, so this session is about regulation and how it enables innovation. It's a interesting title, I would say, because I think a lot of times when the regulator shows up in the room, the first thing that they might think about, or the first reaction they may have, is this one. And that's kind of understandable because, the regulator is often like the eternal teacher and examiner, right? The only time they are engaged is when somebody needs something approved or somebody's trying to come back into into an approval, into being able to do what they're doing. So I think we first have to think through a couple of short statements that might remind us what regulations are there for, what regulators are responsible for. So we have innovations and they deliver benefits to society. And this is,
sorry to interrupt, but there's a square, a gray square in the middle of your presentation.
Sorry. Is it gone now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, sorry, it's the Zoom chat square. So innovations deliver benefits to society. This is what they do. This is why people want them. This is why everything that's going on, I think, in this community of the maker community and also the regulator community, this is, I think, clear. Societies are, of course, based on a common set of values. Societies may have different values, but societies in general have these values. It might be in the case of aviation, which is where I work, it's of course safety, security, environmental protection, and now things also like data protection. So there are these values that societies have. And if we protect those values, it provides trust that whatever the innovation is, when it delivers on a benefit, it is operating in a way where those values are not violated. And so really, the regulations are there to provide that protection. And I think there's nothing in the last four statements that is a surprise to anybody. However, somehow all of this together, although we are very clear on, who does what, kind of, and why, we still have, I think, generally in the innovation community, kind of feeling like, well, I'm not sure that the regulation is helping me. There are some things about the way, the approach, the time. If you look at many forms that regulators have, I think a lot of people feel that it's asking for a lot of information, but there's a delay to the delivering on that benefit that we spoke about earlier that makes it feel like, well, I don't think regulation is really helping innovation. Now, this is a graph that comes from KPMG. They had one of their many reports on innovation. And although you might not be able to read the individual things, basically everything to the right as technology, and this is specific, I think, to aviation, but it's everything to the right are things that are technologies that are being sunsetted, processes being sunsetted. So because aviation, you'll see it's turboprops, it's hub to hub as a business model, things like that. And to the left, you have all of the new things, all the innovations, all the way from things that might happen tomorrow or kind of happening today, 3D printing, drones, of course, to things that are still kind of outliers like quantum computing. But what's important, and this slide can be used in so many different ways, but what is important for us to understand is that regulations were put in place to do the things on the right. And we're not necessarily going to assume that if it could solve and protect the public interests for the things on the right, that it can do it the same way on the things on the left. So we have to study the behavior of the ecosystem of regulations. So here we have a couple of scenarios to do a little bit of a stress test, but of course it's not scientific, this is just indicative. And so in the first one, we're looking at the efficiency versus the cost versus the benefit. So when you have a high degree of efficiency of regulation, which is the left bar here, then it should have a very affordable cost of innovation, which is the middle bar. And then that would make it more affordable, make it more widespread, and therefore the benefit is also then large. But if that efficiency gets depressed, then I think it's quite clear that the cost goes up and the benefit goes down. It's a relationship, I think, that gives some insight into the right balance of the different players here. So let's try a few other ones of these. I think I have 4 in general. So let's talk about now about effectiveness versus trust and benefits. So you can have a lot of regulations, you can have few regulations, but overall there needs to be an effectiveness of these regulations. And what is an effective regulation? Sorry for the bar again. What is the effectiveness of a regulation? Therefore, it's to do that thing of protecting the public interest, and that then gives trust to the system. So when you have a good, effective regulation, you'll have trust and you have benefit, of course. Now, if this effectiveness decreases, then you have the trust go down and the benefit go down. This is not necessarily a linear motion, because with a lot of trust components, there is usually a threshold at which the entire market disappears, right? So if people think that their drones that they're flying are taking pictures of them and sending it to people that they don't know, then that once that trust is broken, the market will really disappear. So that's, although I show them here a little bit as linear or at least exponential, there is that binary component to it. This third scenario looks at change versus cost versus benefit. So the change is a change of regulation. We have to assume, and you probably know because you interact with regulation all the time, that regulations do change. And you want to keep this rate of change low because every change requires that change to be implemented and incurs some cost. And then, of course, the benefit falls from that. In engineering, when you talk about turbulence, and I'm an aeronautical engineer, so that's why I like to make these analogies. Turbulence is caused when you try to change a system quicker than it can absorb that change. So if something is buffeting wind and changing the pressure of the system, but not giving enough time for the system to provide, to get into a state of equilibrium, that's when you get turbulence. And this is the same, I think, for any system where that sense of change. And here again, if the rate goes up, then the cost goes up and the benefit comes down. The fourth scenario that I just wanted to demonstrate here is that we're now looking on the left-hand side of the knowledge of regulations. So up to now, we were talking about efficiency, effectiveness, and the rate of change. Those are normally agency functions, right? Those the governments do that, but the knowledge of regulation is also very important, because if you have a company that's creating a new product and they don't understand the regulations that they would fall under, then you'll have an issue. You have a relationship with cost and benefit again. So high amount of knowledge of the regulations, your costs will be contained relatively low, and then the benefits there. Now, if a company doesn't know the regulations, the cost of innovation goes pretty much to the roof, because of course, you're going to have to redesign, you're going to have to reevaluate the market and all of that. And here again, the benefits do have a threshold. If a company or an innovator doesn't understand or doesn't know the regulations, it does break the trust. And so I've been working with three variables here, but of course, in this ecosystem, we are talking about multiple relationships. Okay. So these are just a couple of dynamic things we wanted to go over. But I think what we can generally see from all this is that the rate of change of regulations and the knowledge of the regulations, that's how we can ensure that, to extent possible, of course, that the regulations are enabling innovation. So I'll just go to a few solutions here, or what we can do about all this. So first, we need to calm down the regulatory change, the rate of regulatory change. And what's important there is that we understand, of course, that we're talking about a highly connected ecosystem. And the ecosystem is that of regulations. There may be thousands, hundreds of thousands of requirements. And we need to understand that as an ecosystem, because you cannot just say, stop regulating for a while, because all of these changes to the regulations comes from requirements, comes from reports of what went wrong, or comes from new things coming online. And we see that quite often. So about 5 years ago, during the winter holiday period, when people get a lot of gifts outside my window in Montreal, I saw a lot of drones flying, and you can see that in the night because they have those red lights. And then that caused the regulatory response, which started to get worried about what's happening with all these drones, again, with the public interest in mind. And they implemented a new rule on who can fly drones and who and when they can fly them. And the next seasons, gift giving seasons in the winter, I saw no drones flying. And that doesn't mean that the drone market was not ready for that change, or that it just means that society does have an effect through regulation. And so if you have this negative effect in the ecosystem through change, you have to look at, you cannot just prescribe it to be low, this amount of change. So it really is an optimization problem. And I'm going to take a little segue on this optimization problem because I am an engineer, and I do like to show things sometimes with equations, but we'll take a little segue. But once we've optimized it, then we know how to apply innovation to regulation. And I think this is very important for the maker community to understand, where we have a lot of energy and volunteered energy into innovating technologies, into innovating solutions, into innovating processes, into innovating even ways to access markets. We need the same kind of approach to innovating in regulation. And it would be interesting to see a couple of maker communities, maybe even a fab lab that is engaged almost primarily on how to innovate regulation. So back to the optimization, because when you innovate regulation, you need to compare it. I need to compare it to something that we've seen before. So I'm going to take a little segue and do a little bit of math on the weekend. Sorry for this for a weekend mathematics exercise. But basically, if you look at regulations and you have a certain number of regulations, each regulation can have a value, usually between 0 and 1, which expresses how well it's implemented. For example, if you have a stop sign at a road, then if there's a stop sign, it's clearly visible, then it's probably a 1 because it's fully implemented. But if it's in a language that people don't know, then of course that effectiveness is reduced. If there is a tree that's planted in front of the sign so people cannot see it, then its effectiveness is reduced. But there is a value that we could assign to represent the effectiveness of the implementation of a regulation. Then if we have these performance requirements, so those are the public values. So in the case of the stop sign, it is safety. It is to stop accidents from happening. And you have a regulation and you have the thing that it tries to, the performance it tries to achieve. And then you can combine those two, and it gets a little bit weird here, but basically there is a way to say that if I have all of these regulations, I can map them to all these performance things. So if you're talking about safety at a crossroad, of course, a stop sign helps. But then things like how much space you give the pedestrian for walking, the use of the zebra crossing signs, right? There are many regulations that work towards the same performance, which is safety. And then you have this relationship between all of these different regulations and how they together are going to deliver on the performance. Mathematically, it can be represented in an equation like this. There are many equations we could use, but what's maybe clearer through a use of an equation like this is that this becomes a classical optimization problem. And the optimization problems are what's, I think, driving a lot of the AI, a lot of the machine learning side. And that should not surprise us, because at the end of the day, regulations and their relationship to innovation is, in fact, an optimization issue. Maybe to add a little bit of visual to what this looks like. So what you see here are about 5,000 standards that we have in our organization that tries to help regulation in aviation. And all this really shows is the relationship between all of the different regulations to each other. And you see these little white constellations as spherical constellations. That happens because these are the definitions. So in one place in our regulation, we define all the terms, and therefore they show up like this. This is just really a visual that is not helpful in another way except to communicate to the community that we are talking about an ecosystem of a lot of different variables that need to be optimized. So the final part, which I wanted to cover in this very short talk, was that knowledge of regulations is very important. A lot of people, I think, may have a couple of nightmares when it comes to taking their innovation and making available for other people to use. Of course, financial issues are usually part of that. Other things like, well, maybe somebody already did this and I just don't know about it. I'm going to show up with something that's already been done. But one of the ones that I think it generally a little less focused on is that you need to know the laws. If you solve for the laws of, if you solve, you got to solve for these regulations the same time you solve for whatever you're solving for. If you found a new way, new type of propulsion, that's great. but you also need to know the laws of man or humans as much as the laws of physics. And what's important here is that this knowledge level is actually not with the regulator, it's with the innovator. And it sometimes is a bit of a steep learning curve because for one thing, physics and other things that are, or programming, STEM itself is taught at a very young age, and people go into maker labs knowing all of this basic stuff. But the aspects of human laws and the values of society and the protection of the public, this is not normally, something that we might teach to the same people who are in the maker community. But the sooner you get to know the laws, the sooner you can help make them better, of course, but also the sooner you can find solutions that not only obey the laws of physics, but also the laws of society. One of the key parts is not to simplify, not to oversimplify. It is a complex part of the ecosystem, I would say, but it is not difficult to find a way to navigate through it most of the time. And what's very important, though, is to not oversimplify what it's trying to do. So again, in the example of the crossing, there are many regulations that require us to install physical defenses against potential accidents at a crossing, but then also, human factor related. We train people, kids are taught how to look on both sides of the road before they cross them. So there are a lot of things that are going on. It's an ecosystem, but if we simplify it too much and say, well, if we remove the light, then we don't really lose any safety. That's when there is going to be problems, unexpected problems with the way that the effectiveness of regulation. So that's what I wanted to just brainstorm about. I think that's the better word here. And really, I don't look at regulation as something that is a headwind. You can use the regulation and the regulatory frameworks to help solve these problems that you're trying to do to make your innovation work. And there are, in most regulatory environments, I would say, very receptive regulators who are willing to have feedback into how they can improve the regulations. But in the long term, this might be a bit ironic, but in the long term, I really think that the future regulations are going to come out of brainstorming and environments like you have set up in Fab Labs. Only they'll be talking about regulations and how to improve them, not about how to use the latest drone for society. So thank you very much, and open to any questions, of course.